So I want to ask you a question now. Have you ever noticed that when you move your mind into the feeling of your breath, you feel better? Has anybody ever noticed that? And you can kind of just do it now, just even with your eyes open. We're not going to go into a meditation just yet, but just as a little precursor. And you just move your mind to the feeling of the breath. And what most people discover is in a relatively short amount of time, this movement of mind into the breath enables a shift. We start to feel a little bit better. It just takes a little bit of the edge off. In fact, when I'm teaching my live in-person classes, typically whenever I'm giving a teaching on a breathing meditation, while I'm still giving the teaching, I can see people in the room like closing their eyes and just feeling their breath. And what I can see very clearly when people do this is that they really need the relief, right? So that's why they're not even waiting for me to complete the teaching before going to the breath. And secondly, what I can see very clearly is that their physiology changes. I can see them starting to relax just through a couple of seconds of feeling the breath. So why does this happen? And how does it relate to self-compassion? So there's two ways that I'm going to define mindfulness this morning. One way, if you've been in any classes with me, you will know this definition, hopefully by heart. But then I'm going to deepen the definition. And the second definition that I'm going to go into is not one that you'll have commonly heard. It's not one, if you Google it, it doesn't come up. It doesn't come up on Wikipedia. It doesn't come up in most mainstream discussions of mindfulness. And yet it is at the very essence of mindfulness and how mindfulness can be one of the greatest acts of self-compassion a person can engage in. So the first typical definition of mindfulness is simply intentional awareness, right? That's what mindfulness is. It's intentional awareness. So if I were to clap my hands, right, and you heard that sound, that could be considered that's a form of unintentional awareness, meaning you didn't actually choose to become aware of that sound, right? I made you aware of that sound. That's unintentional awareness. That's different from mindfulness. But then a couple of moments ago when I asked you to feel your breath, right? So you chose to become intentionally aware, mindful of the feeling of the breath. You moved your mind. That's mindfulness. That choosing to become intentionally aware or intentionally present. Intentional presence is actually the same thing as intentional awareness. But then there's another way to understand mindfulness, and this is what we're going to begin to tap into with this first guided meditation and this first kind of teaching and understanding of practice. And the second, less commonly understood and discussed definition of mindfulness is that mindfulness is the art or the act of remembering. That's what it is. It's the art or the act of remembering. What is it that we're remembering? That we have a mind. What is it that we're remembering? That we're here too. That there's something in here that has very much to do with ourselves, our lives, how we show up in the world, but that mostly gets negated and neglected through our endless busyness. We remember. So I use the term mind. What is it? Is it that we're remembering? We're remembering that we have a mind. So for most people, the word mind, we only ever associate the word mind with the thinking mind. In fact, I was in a yoga class, I guess it was a couple months ago. No, it was an online yoga class. So it was just a couple weeks ago. And the teacher said, for this next, 60 minutes, I want you to leave your mind outside the room. And I thought, how will I move? It's my mind that's understanding the direction that you're telling me to do. It's my mind that's actually choosing to move my body. This is how I do yoga. Isn't that how you guys do yoga? No? Maybe I need more instruction. But it's the mind that's understanding the direction and that is creating the intention to move the body. So the thinking mind is just an aspect of the mind, but it's not your entire mind. A nice way to understand what your mind is it's the animating force of you behind the physical. Okay? The animating force behind the physical. Sometimes it's called the soul, the spirit, the heart. Perfect. We're all kind of talking about the same thing. In my world, I just call it the mind so that we can kind of steer clear of any religious beliefs or lack thereof. It's the mind, it's the animating force behind the physical that we all have. If we're still alive and someone has just passed away, we can all pretty easily agree that there's a very big difference between us who's still alive and someone who's just passed away. And an easy way to talk about that is that the animating force behind that physical body of that person is no longer connected with the body. And then wherever it goes, whatever it does is part of your religious or spiritual beliefs or lack thereof, whatever it is. But the animating force is what I'm calling the mind, the animating force behind the physical. So as we get so busy and are so always externally oriented, the number one thing that we tend to forget is that we're in here too, is that we have a mind. And through that simple act of becoming mindful, intentionally aware of the feeling of the breath, why it can work so quickly and so efficiently to help kind of make a shift. And it's almost like a relief, right? When we go to the feeling of the breath, it's almost like it's a relief. Why is it a relief? Most people can understand that when we just associate ourselves with all the stuff that we get done on a daily basis or all the stuff that we don't get done on a daily basis, life starts to suck, right? If all you're ever connecting your mind with is what I call the gross aspects of who we are as people, and I don't mean like gross, like, ew, icky, right? Not that kind of gross. Gross meaning you can take a picture of it. That's the easiest way to define a gross phenomenon. You can take a picture of it. So your body is gross. Getting the groceries is gross. Attending to your work, answering emails, dotting your I's and crossing your T's, and cleaning your house and putting gas in the car, and all this stuff, all the jobs that we do of life are really us attending to the grosser aspects of who we are as people. Years ago, I used to teach a drug court class for people coming out after multiple DUIs. And, it was a hard class to teach for the first couple of years. I struggled with it until I kind of realized how to teach it or learned how to teach it. And what I discovered is that almost everybody on the planet loves to learn about their own mind and the functionality of our own minds. And once I realized that, and it became a class about learning about the functionality of our own mind and how to use the tool of our mind to create greater benefit for both ourself and the world around us, it became easier to teach the class. It resonated more with that particular population. So I've taught people coming out of jail. I've taught the police officers who put them there. I've taught counselors and therapists and social workers and judges and soccer moms and kids and older folk and everybody in between. And why I bring this up is because within this realm, this broad cross-section of community and society, almost every single one of us can agree that if all we're ever attending to is the grosser aspects of our lives, the buying the groceries, the busyness, the tasks, the work, the filling the fridge, the cooking the dinner, the cleaning the floors, the punching the time card, that if that's all that we're ever engaged in, life starts to take on a meaningless quality. Life starts to become just like a series of jobs. And then as we age and get a little bit older, life becomes just a series of very tiring jobs, right? So why does the breath work so well, both as an act or the art of remembering, but also to create kind of a certain degree of relief within us? It's a relief to remember that we're in here as well. But there's another reason that the breath works so well. It's because the breath is a more subtle phenomenon. So now I'm going to differentiate between gross phenomenon and subtle phenomenon, and then we'll do a meditation, okay? So I describe gross phenomenon as that which you can take a picture of, right? It's your body is gross. I can touch it. I can see it quite easily. Take a picture of it. Subtle phenomenon, as it turns out, you can't as easily take a picture of it. So there are 4 aspects that make up subtle phenomenon. The 4 aspects: it has no color, Subtle phenomenon has no shape. You cannot hold subtle phenomenon, and you cannot touch it. Has no shape, no color. You cannot hold it and you cannot touch it. So as it turns out, the breath is a more subtle phenomenon. Has no color, no shape. You can't hold it. I mean, you can, right, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's not like you can't pick up the breath and like move it across the room, and you can't really touch it. So it turns out to be a more subtle phenomenon. We know subtle phenomenon. In fact, the typical way I talk about it is, say there are two friends. They've gone out to have coffee or tea together, tea and crumpets together. And you can look at them. You can take a picture of them. They can put their arms around each other, smile, thumbs up, hold up their crumpet. I don't actually even know what a crumpet is, but it sounds nice to go with a friend and have some tea and crumpets. But anyway, so there's this aspect of their interaction that we can all see. Two friends, she's wearing a floral colored skirt, he's got brown hair and a mustache, whatever. But then there's a more subtle aspect of what's happening between these two people. In some of my leadership classes, we call it the second conversation. There's the first conversation that you can hear, and it's about the crumpets and the tea and about life in general. But then there's the second conversation that's happening just below the surface. And that has to do with more subtle phenomenon. It's the feelings that are created between these people. It's the innuendo. It's the connection that you couldn't actually put a finger on, but you know it's there. You can feel it, but you just can't maybe see it. You can't hold it. It doesn't have a color and it doesn't have a shape. It's more subtle phenomenon. So let me put what we're talking about into this type of context as well. When we move our minds into the feeling of the breath, another way of understanding what we're doing is we're practicing shifting our minds from gross to subtle. We're shifting our minds from the grosser stuff of life, the busyness of life, into the more subtle aspect of who we are as people. And in so doing, we are remembering that we are not just a series of accomplishments and jobs and tasks and lack of tasks and lack of completion of the tasks and not doing the tasks well enough, right? Those minds of not good enough and never enough. There's a more subtle phenomenon that you can even either understand that it drops below the surface of that, all of that stuff of doing, or you can understand that it transcends it, that it rises above it. And so when we move our minds, our attention into the more subtle phenomenon of the breath, it turns out to be a movement of mind from gross to subtle. And in so doing, we remember that we have a mind. We remember the more subtle aspects of who we are as people. And this, my darlings, turns out to be one of the greatest acts of stress reduction, of self-compassion that a human being can engage in. Most of the time, the number one reason that I get that people don't meditate consistently, you can probably guess what it is. Almost everybody says, I just don't have the time. I'm too busy. I'm too busy. So they are too busy to remember themselves. They are too busy. We are too busy to spend some time in our day to share our attention with ourselves. We are too busy to see ourselves. We are too busy to feel ourselves. You know what that turns into very quickly? Neglect. That's what that is. When you allocate zero time, and it's sometimes easier to understand this when you think about it as another person, like a child. A neglected child gets no time from their caregivers, no attention from their caregivers. That's a form of neglect. We can see it easily when it's kind of put outside ourselves. And when you spend no time giving your own self a certain degree of attention, affection, just listening to yourself, just feeling yourself, remembering that you're even in there, that's a form of neglect. And neglect feeds it on a daily basis, those two minds of not good enough and never enough.